Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. Well, today we're going back to some Historia Civilis. They had a new video come out about a week and a half ago about the July Revolution. A lot of revolutions happening in the 19th century in Europe, in France, and in a lot of other places as well. So Historia Civilis always does a fantastic job with his research and his presentation and telling the story in a way that makes it really accessible, and I think easy to understand, but also presents these complex issues in a way that makes them kind of understandable. So with all of that said, this is a 47-minute video, so we're going to cover the first half or so today. We'll come back tomorrow with the second half of it. I want to make sure that we don't take up your whole day with all of this, or my whole day for that matter. I want to congratulate Historia Civilis. Looks like they just went over 1 million subscribers since the last time we visited. So I will put a link down in the description. I think this is a very popular channel. Most of the feedback I get when we cover one of their videos is always very positive, so I expect this to be no different. I've been spending a lot of time recently studying the Napoleonic Wars. Of course, this is right in the immediate aftermath of that, so a lot of the context, of course, is the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, and then what comes after. So this will be an interesting one to dive into and cover in a little more depth. Let's go ahead and do that. Love his little squares.
France in the early 1820s had done the impossible. They had reintegrated themselves back into the international system as a great power. But in 1823, that all changed. For some reason, France recklessly invaded Spain, which brought the great powers to the brink of war and almost took down the international system.
Yeah, remember that at this point there have been 7 coalitions of European countries going to war with France in the previous 30 years, going back to the French Revolution. And this all stems from a desire to keep revolutionary France from going in a different direction than having the monarchy. And so a lot of it is about getting rid of the French government, later on getting rid of Napoleon. And so these 7 coalitions are formed. And so there's, in the aftermath, you have the Congress of Vienna, and Europe is just really, really nervous about France getting too uppity again after that.
Why did France get like 20% stupider in the 1820s? It's an important question, and to answer it, we will have to go back to where we left off with French politics. 1820, 3 years before France recklessly invaded Spain. The 1820s were when things really began to change in France, and it started when the nephew of the King of France was stabbed to death by a left-wing radical. This event sent shockwaves through French politics. The aristocracy and their allies in the French legislature, the ultra-conservatives, demanded immediate action. During the crisis, superstar politician Richelieu was brought back into government, and as prime minister, he pushed through a series of changes to the French electoral system. Up until now, the process had been that 1/5 of the legislators were elected every year, and the trend over the last 5 years had been that every year, the ultra-conservatives were losing ground to the centrists and the left-wing Republicans. With the assassination of the king's nephew, the ultra-conservatives were officially freaked out at the rise of the French left, and Richelieu was committed to stopping them from making any more electoral gains. Under the new system, 40% of the seats in the legislature would be elected by a select group of ultra-wealthy elites who...
It's amazing to me that France would go down this path given everything that has happened before this. You would think they would have learned some lessons about giving too much power to the wealthy, to the aristocracy, to the landed, to the people with titles and things like that. But for some reason, they keep defaulting in that direction and then being surprised when there's a revolution.
Were a lot more conservative and pro-monarchy than the general public. That was precisely the point. The people around the king were getting worried about the mood of the public, so they just insulated themselves from public opinion. They came from the maybe if I ignore my problems, they'll just go away school of thought.
This same family. I mean, you have King Louis XVI, who is executed during the French Revolution, and then eventually his brother, Louis XVIII, comes to the throne, and he's the one that gets put on the throne after Napoleon is defeated in 1814, and then he has to take off, and then when Napoleon is defeated again in 1815, he comes back again. He's fat, he's kind of deaf to the needs of the people, and really he's just the only other option, which is why they keep going back to him.
They made elections a lot less frequent for the same reason. The thing about elections is that the more representative they are, the more stabilizing they are to the state. It forces governments to address problems early.
That's true.
Before they become existential threats. It gives opposition groups something productive to do.
And in the absence of that, you get revolution. Because if people feel their voices aren't being heard, if they feel like they don't have a say in what's going on and that the government's not listening to them, especially in a place like France where it's like in their DNA to protest and to rebel and to fight back. I saw that when I was in Paris. There were like major protests going on.
Would you rather have angry opposition groups handing out leaflets or stockpiling weapons?
Right.
Which do you think is better for the long-term health of the state? But that only works if elections are fair. Without fair elections, groups are forced to get creative.
Because again, this is the same thing. Whether you're not having elections at all or you're having elections that are unfair, the end result is that people think their voices aren't being heard and people feel like they don't have any power, so they're going to take it.
And the probability of a rebellion or a civil war or a revolution increases. So France's electoral reforms in 1820 made the French state more brittle. And they did this to insulate the king and his preferred ultra-conservatives from their own growing unpopularity. In my opinion, it was a stupid thing to do. But the ultra-conservatives didn't see it as stupid. In the next election under this new rigged electoral system, the ultra-conservatives won 85% of the seats in the French legislature.
I mean, think about that. If the previous 4 years have all been a trend away from the ultra-conservatives and suddenly they take a big majority again, a lot of people are going to have a problem with that.
Absolutely dominating every other group that voiced any opposition to the king's will. The ultra-conservatives thought that they had pulled off a soft coup. They thought that they had won. But it was all an illusion. Even with 85% of the seats in the French legislature, the ultra-conservatives were still unpopular with the people.
Yeah, and here's the thing. Just because you're taking the seats at the top and you're taking overall power, that doesn't necessarily filter into all of the various localities. This is something that Napoleon did really well, is that he recognized that it wasn't just about the central authority in Paris. It was about having authority in every single commune, every village, every town.
The electoral reforms didn't fix that fundamental problem. It only concealed it. In fact, they had sown the seeds of their own destruction. With the huge ultra-conservative majority in the legislature, the centrist Prime Minister Richelieu was replaced by an extreme conservative named Villèle. And then a few years later, when the Spanish liberals rose up to remove their autocratic king from power, Villèle persuaded the King of France to invade. It's clear why Villèle felt threatened by this, right? He was trying to re-establish autocratic rule in his own country, and he feared the French liberals doing in France what the Spanish liberals were doing in Spain.
So by doing this, he's turned France into exactly what France was facing during the Napoleonic Wars, which is every time France kind of resorted to its own government that wasn't the monarchy, you had all of these external nations that felt threatened by what that could mean for them and by the power that France had and the influence that France had. And so they formed these coalitions against France to kind of keep them in check and hopefully restore the Bourbon monarchy. Now you've got France doing the same thing. Oh boy, if that happens in Spain, it could happen here, so we're going to invade Spain. Hypocrites.
Foreshadowing, baby.
Invading Spain was not wise, but Villel was not thinking strategically. He was only thinking about his narrow political interests. Sharing a border with liberal Spain was not an existential threat to France. It did not require a military intervention, but it was politically inconvenient for France's ultra-conservative faction, so they invaded anyways. You'd think that the decision to invade a country for political reasons would spark a lively debate in the French legislature, but it didn't. The legislature was 85% ultra-conservative.
Nothing to debate.
And with the new rigged voting system.
So basically you have just a rubber stamp on anything that the government wants to do.
Nobody in the government was particularly worried about the next election.
Yep.
Everybody just mindlessly went along with Villel and the king. The fact that this dramatically increased the chance of a world war, a great power conflict, didn't bother any of them.
Yeah, this is 8 years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Everybody's still going to be hypersensitive about France with an army invading another European country. How they did not see this or how they did not accept that reality is beyond me. It's tone deaf.
That was far less important to them than their goofy ultra-conservative ideology. It's worth repeating that the French people were not on board with this. The ultra-conservatives had never been popular. They only dominated the legislature because the elections had been rigged to favor them. The people favored the liberals and the Republicans. The centrist liberals hated the invasion for obvious reasons. The Spanish liberals were their ideological brothers. The left-wing Republicans hated it too. The Spanish Constitution had been the invention of their beloved Emperor Napoleon. To the millions of Frenchmen who had at one time served under him, the thought of invading another country just to undo the work of Napoleon was unthinkable. But none of that opposition mattered. The invasion of Spain went ahead anyways, and in the next French election, 96% of the seats went to the ultra-conservatives. Now, there was virtually no domestic political opposition to whatever Villel and the King of France wanted to do. But I'll say it again, there was plenty of opposition out on the streets. It's just that the political system had been designed so that none of those people were allowed to participate in politics anymore.
So they're going to force themselves on the government. They're going to force their voices to be heard.
Shortly after this, King Louis XVIII, the man who had been restored to the throne after the fall of Napoleon, died. He was succeeded by his younger brother, a much more autocratic and conservative man who took the name of Charles X.
Yeah, so this is the third brother in this family. You had Louis XVI, Louis XVIII. I know they're both Louis, but they were brothers. And now Charles X, who is a brother in the same family.
Under King Charles and his ultra-conservative Prime Minister Villel, liberals and Republicans working within the government were purged. Purged is such a heavy word. They were fired. They weren't killed. Villel then began to systematically roll back the reforms of the French Revolution in an effort to return France to an 18th century political mindset.
What could possibly go wrong? The brother of the current king was executed because people wanted reform, because people were angry about the control that a small aristocratic rich few had. So let's go back to that. What could possibly go wrong?
The previous king had promised to never do this, and that promise had kept the peace in France for the last 9 years. The new king...
He promised that because that's what he needed to promise in order to be able to be put back on the throne. He twice had to be restored to the throne after Napoleon, and so he was going to say whatever it took in order to be able to get his place, figuring once he was there, okay, I made the promise. Charles didn't make that promise.
Did not feel bound by that promise. Bear in mind that none of these moves were popular, and the people weren't afraid to let him know. public outcry reached a fever pitch, and in order to insulate the government from any further criticism, Villèle clamped down on the liberal press with heavy censorship laws.
When you start facing this kind of opposition, you have two choices. Do we listen? Do we say, you know what, maybe we should give them a voice. Maybe we should bring this back from the ledge. Or do you double down? And how many times in history have people made the mistake of doubling down and it cost them everything?
And maybe if I ignore my problems, they'll just go away.
Whistles a jaunty tune.
It soon became clear that the new king had a pretty old-fashioned attitude when it came to his prime minister. At the beginning of each year, the king gave Villèle a list of priorities, and it was Villèle's job throughout the year to simply make everything on that list a law. It was like the king was his own prime minister, and Villèle was his little assistant or something. Under such a system, it's not clear what the purpose of elections would even be. There's not really any point if the king's just gonna personally dominate the legislature no matter what.
It's to give the appearance of people having a say. It's to make people think they have a choice when they really don't.
I frankly don't understand why Villèle tolerated being humiliated in this way, but I guess it was the logical conclusion of his extreme ultra-conservative ideology.
Yeah, you gather for yourselves yes men, and soon you become a yes man yourself.
One of the things that the king ordered Villèle to do was compensate the aristocracy for the loss of their land during the revolution. The land was long gone, so what Villèle had to do was pay the rich by taxing the poor. It was exactly as popular with the people as you might imagine. The new taxes weren't even sufficient.
Could you imagine? Could you even imagine how that went down? These are people who, many of whom had lost fathers and sons and brothers in the Napoleonic Wars, who had had family members who died fighting in the revolution to free themselves from exactly this.
So France had to plunge itself deeply into debt in order to finance this scheme. And for what? Just to reestablish the supremacy of the French aristocracy.
Oh boy.
The country was politically unstable, and the poor were still struggling to find enough to eat. The king's political instincts were all out of whack. An actual election would have helped the king to refocus on what was actually important.
Yep.
But he didn't care about actual elections. As the years passed, the king and Villèle continued their politically unpopular ultra-conservative crusade, which had the unintended, but in my opinion, obvious side effect of making France incredibly politically unstable. In 1827, as the king was performing a routine inspection of the Paris National Guard, the guardsmen surprised him with impromptu cries of "Down with Villèle." When officers tried to establish order, one guardsman decided to go down in history as an absolute legend and punched his superior officer in the face, right in front of the king.
So here's the thing. You might think, well, if Villèle's just the yes man, why would they be shouting down with him? Why not down with the king? Well, there's certain lines people aren't willing to cross, and especially if you see the king as an anointed sovereign chosen by God. And this goes back through centuries of history. You don't attack the king directly. That would be treason. What you do is you go after his advisors. You go after the people who represent the king. That's the way you attack the king without attacking the king.
Pretty soon, the officers completely lost control of the men. They were unable to stop another guardsman from breaking ranks and screaming treasonous stuff right in the king's face. It was a wake-up call for the ultra-conservatives. The next day, Villèle's government disbanded the Paris National Guard. The backlash was here, and even the rank and file in the military were coming out openly against the king.
The military speaks out, so all right, get rid of the military. Oh my gosh. Could you imagine a more just continued series of wrong moves after wrong moves?
Villèle thought that this might just be the beginning of a period of unpopularity for the government, and so he advised the king to call an early election so that they could lock in their legislative majority for the next 7 years. Yes, they had been working tirelessly this entire time to make elections as infrequent as possible. When we started this story, there was an election every year. Now there was an election every 7 years. If he locked in a legislative majority now, Villèle hoped that all of his autocratic reforms would be done within the next 7 years. And after that, maybe he wouldn't have to worry about elections at all anymore. The Liberal and Republican opposition groups saw this as an existential crisis. They feared that in 7 years' time, this may all be gone, and that this may literally be the last French election. The electoral system was still rigged against the opposition, but nevertheless, the Liberals and the Republicans threw every resource they had into rallying public opinion and coming out in force. Here were the results of the 1827 French election. 46% of the seats went to a coalition of Liberal and Republican opposition groups. 45% of the seats went to Villèle's ultra-conservative government coalition. 7% of the seats went to a conservative group that opposed Villèle's government. Even under the rigged electoral system, the liberal opposition groups unexpectedly won the most seats. They were ecstatic.
You called an early election to solidify your hold on the government, and you ended up losing it instead.
The king and Villèle had made a historic blunder. To make matters worse, it quickly became clear that all of these groups hated each other, and so nobody was able to put together a governing majority. The king was now stuck with a deadlocked legislature for the next 7 years.
Yeah, and there's the problem with holding elections so infrequently, is now you can't undo the problem that you created for yourself.
The king fired Villèle and selected a new ultra-conservative prime minister who believed that they could find compromises with the liberals.
Good luck.
But the liberals and the other opposition groups were high on their electoral victory and out for blood, so none of them would agree to work with any ultra-conservative prime minister. If the king really wanted to work with the liberals, then he should select a liberal prime minister.
Yep.
But he didn't. Over the next year and a half, the legislature accomplished virtually nothing. Eventually, the king grew frustrated and fired his failed compromise prime minister in favor of somebody who actually shared his politics. In 1829, he appointed an extreme right-wing ultra-conservative named Polignac as prime minister. If a compromise ultra-conservative couldn't figure out how to pass anything in the legislature, then an extreme ultra-conservative definitely wouldn't either. But the king no longer cared. He just wanted somebody who shared his views to start.
Instead of somebody who's going to be able to work with these people, pick someone that's just like you that also won't be able to work with these people. I mean, at the very least, obviously hindsight's 20/20. If you pick somebody from the liberal side, you're still the king. You still are going to have influence and sway over that person. At least then you can get something done.
Start pushing people around. Just to give you a sense of how extreme this new prime minister was, during the Napoleonic Wars, he was implicated in an attempt to assassinate the emperor and was imprisoned for 9 years.
And here's the thing about these assassination attempts, is that part of what pushed Napoleon to become emperor instead of just first consul was the fact that these assassination attempts kept happening and these plots kept happening. And so he became very concerned about having a line of succession. And that's why he ends up being crowned as emperor, to kind of combat threats like this. So when you're dealing with liberals and Republicans, who many of whom were pro-Napoleon, and now you've got to deal with a prime minister who spent 9 years in prison for trying to assassinate Napoleon? I mean, could you pick a worse possible candidate than that? I got so worked up over that, I almost knocked my microphone over.
After the king was restored to the throne, Polignac's political right-hand man argued for rounding up Napoleon's supporters and putting them to death.
Wow.
The liberal opposition groups.
Let's just go back to the days of the guillotine with the terror. Just be Robespierre already. What could go wrong?
and in particular their Republican allies, were justifiably alarmed that the king would allow men like this to get anywhere near government. In addition to all of this, the king was sending an undeniable signal with this appointment. He was signaling that it did not particularly matter what the results of the election were, since he was perfectly comfortable running everything through his unelected and unrepresentative prime minister. Perhaps a taste of what the future of France may look like. Around this time, King Charles decided to invade Algeria. He had some pretext for this, but the pretext doesn't really matter. The real reason is that France lost virtually all of its colonies after its defeat at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and the king felt that establishing a new colony in Algeria would restore French prestige. I would just ask you, is this a good reason to establish a colony?
I mean, what is a good reason to establish a colony? Is there a reason that's better than the reason why any of the other European powers were establishing colonies in Africa? I don't know. Of all the things that I would be critical of the King of France for, he's really just acting like all the other countries in Europe. Doesn't make it okay, but I'm not really sure that any special blame can be ascribed to him that wouldn't apply to everybody else too.
What would our beloved George Canning say about this? Canning had argued that colonies were only useful insofar as they facilitated trade. I don't recall him saying anything about making the king feel better about past humiliations. You will see this argument made time and time again by mediocre men in the 19th century. They will become obsessed with how colonies look on a map, and then will use the map to justify the policy. But the point of colonies cannot be how they look on a map. The map is an abstraction, a theoretical tool. They're not real. What's real is conditions on the ground. What would the invasion of Algeria do to improve the material conditions in France? Nothing. In fact, it was worse than nothing. France would have to send 20% of its army overseas. It was France's second unnecessary invasion in only 7 years. It destroyed France's military readiness for basically no reason. If there was a crisis in Europe, France would find it difficult to respond.
I think he's counting on the fact that Europe's not exactly interested in getting into another pan-European war after the millions of deaths in the Napoleonic Wars.
It was a risky plan. Furthermore, France didn't really have any money, and this invasion would impose a massive financial burden. Remember, France was still taxing the poor so that they could give money to the rich. Any additional taxes to finance this reckless invasion would be met with hostility. But King Charles and Prime Minister Polignac wanted to do it, and so they just did it. In 1830, the king opened that year's deadlocked legislature by proposing a relatively modest set of programs. But many politicians found the way that he opened the session alarming. He seemed to subtly threaten violence if any of them stood in the way of his legislation.
And this is the problem, is that even when you're asking for things that would otherwise be reasonable, when you have set such a precedent over time, people are going to see everything from an extreme viewpoint. They're going to see the simplest and the most benign of requests with a side eye and wondering what you're really up to, and they're going to have kind of a knee-jerk reaction against it.
Even hinted that he may act without the approval of the legislature, if necessary.
Why not?
Describing himself as the true representative of the people.
How far do you have to go? I mean, I guess for several years now he's been getting away with this, and so the more you get away with it, the more you think you can get away with.
Not the elected legislature.
How tone deaf are you?
It was a real mask-off moment for the king. Even the king's own ultra-conservatives were bothered. A couple of weeks later, the liberal opposition in the legislature were able to gather enough support to push back against the king. They sent a letter to the king and told him that from now on, the king's ministers, including the prime minister, must have the support of the legislature. The king couldn't just appoint whomever he wished. Elections had to mean something.
Not wrong.
King Charles was incensed by what he perceived to be a direct challenge to his power.
What is it with kings named Charles and going at the power of the legislature? It's exactly what the King Charles who lost his head did during the English Civil War.
Accused the liberals of trying to overthrow the government. He decided that he could not work with these people and immediately dissolved the legislature and called a new election. According to his own electoral reforms, this was 4 years ahead of schedule. But given the current political climate, the liberal opposition was likely to get stronger in the short term, not weaker. And so he thought that he would need a friendly legislature to get him through the coming storm. Elections were scheduled to begin in late June. The date was not an accident. The French army was scheduled to land in Algeria in early June, so the thought was that by the end of the month, there would probably be some good news to bolster support for the ultra-conservatives. One politician begged Prime Minister Polignac to keep the legislature in session all the way up until the election, because he believed that he could cobble together a small working majority of moderates from
Man, you've got people who are willing to work with you, who are willing to compromise, who are willing to make this work. Why can't you listen? Oh, it's so frustrating in hindsight to see people being so ridiculous in the light of what is obviously going downhill fast.
Different factions. Polignac responded, "A majority? That would really cause me problems. I wouldn't know what to do with it." Kind of a shocking thing for a politician to say out loud, but it really shows how Polignac and the king weren't really interested in liberal democracy at all. The ultra-conservative faction was really lost at sea at this point.
The legislature is a speed bump that's in the way of what you're trying to do, that you have to tolerate, but you don't have to give any authority or power or influence to. You're just kind of operating as if they don't exist.
Point. They only cared about investing more and more power into the king and the aristocracy, and very little about any other people or institutions. Polignac wasn't even particularly interested in popular support. What he wanted to do was make elections no longer matter.
And if you're ever wondering why it is that a country like the United Kingdom is able to keep its constitutional monarchy when other countries like France could not, this is why. Because when you had a monarch, they kept trying to take more power. In the case of the British monarchy, they understood what their role needed to be, and they were able to evolve with what was acceptable to the people.
We must now talk about Article 14 of France's Constitution, also known as the Charter. History will hang on the wording of Article 14, so let me just give you the whole thing up front. The king is the supreme head of state, commands the land and the sea forces, declares war, makes treaties of peace, alliances, and commerce, appoints to all places of public administration, and makes the necessary regulations and ordinances for the execution of the laws and the security of the state.
It's a lot of power.
Let's break it down. The king is the head of the state. He commands the military, runs foreign policy, and appoints all the ministers. That's all very straightforward. But then, there's this funny bit at the end. And makes the necessary regulations and ordinances for the execution of the laws and the security of the state.
You could look at that and argue that everything the king has done so far is completely within his constitutional authority. So maybe the problem isn't the king, maybe the problem is the Constitution.
Regulations and ordinances. That basically means laws, right? And makes the necessary laws for the security of the state. Huh.
Yep.
You see what this is, don't you? If the king pressed a giant red button that said, "This is a security matter," he could institute any regulation or law that he wished.
100%.
Who got to decide what was a security matter? The king. It was a giant loophole in the middle of the French Constitution that could theoretically grant the king unlimited power in the name of security.
Yeah, reading that, everything that has happened so far, I look back and think, okay, well, If I'm the king, I feel like I'm executing perfectly lawful power in these scenarios. So I get it. I get why he thought he could do it.
The king's supporters in the ultra-conservatives began to argue that the unruly liberal opposition to the king was a security matter, and if the upcoming election tipped in the liberal direction, the king could use Article 14 to overturn it. Nobody had ever done anything like this before. Even the ultra-conservatives were split on whether it would even be legal. But the ultra-conservatives didn't need to agree. Only the king needed to agree. After some consideration, the king spoke to his closest ministers. If the upcoming election results were not to his liking, he said, then he would, quote, make his prerogative respected. The king was not being explicit, but everybody took his meaning. One way or another, the liberal opposition would be out of power after the next election.
All right, we're going to wrap it up right there. We're halfway through. This is interesting. I tell you what, this whole time I'm thinking, oh, the king's an idiot, the king's an idiot, the king's an idiot. And then they get to that Article 14, and it's like, wow, I get where the king's coming from. They need to fix this. They need to close the loophole. But how do you close the loophole when the king's got all the power? Now you can see why they're going to have to overthrow him. So, all right, we'll come back tomorrow with all of that. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below, and we'll come back with part 2 tomorrow. Thanks for watching.